Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So recently, Tristan Mercadia, or Mercadia, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, asked me a great question, which is something I have touched on previously, but specifically asked me to talk about the English fighting on foot, okay, in particular application to the 100 Years' War. And was that a thing? Is that true that they did that? And why? Well, that's a big question. So I'm going to have to talk in somewhat general terms, and also I'm going to have to go outside of the 100 Years' War. So the first thing that we have to say is I'm holding a Dane axe here. I'm holding the great axe of the era of the Battle of Hastings for a very good reason. Because if we go all the way back to the year 1000, then the Anglo-Saxons and the Scandinavians, and bear in mind that Anglo-Saxon England was very closely interconnected with, partly with Francia, but also with the Scandinavian kingdoms because of successive Scandinavian kings. Okay, so until the Norman conquest, England had been very much associated with Scandinavia. Now bear in mind that during the so-called Dark Ages, there were some nations that used cavalry extensively and some nations that barely used cavalry at all. Okay, and as far as we can tell, Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia barely used cavalry at all. Yes, indeed, there are some mentions of the use of horses, or probably more likely ponies, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources of the Anglo-Saxon era. But by and large, I don't think anybody would try and argue that the Anglo-Saxons were a people who used cavalry much. And then come along the Normans and everything changes. As everyone who looks at the Bayeux Tapestry can see, it's very much characterised by the English standing on top of a hill on foot with shields, things like Dane axes and spears, fighting against the Normans, who, whilst they also have infantry, are very characterised by their large cavalry force. And they weren't only Normans. Remember, there was a large Breton force as well from Brittany. So essentially, and what was that a descendant of? Well, the Norman and the Breton cavalry wasn't particular to Normandy and Brittany. It was in fact particular to what we would now call France or Francia. Okay, and the kingdom or the empire that was Francia under Charlemagne, he made extensive use of cavalry, and I would say it's almost one of the things that characterises Charlemagne's war machine, Charlemagne's military. And you know, we see, for example, when he's fighting with the Saxons in northern Germany, that they seem to predominantly fight on foot, much like the English, as you might expect, given that they're fairly closely related to the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons. Possibly true of the Frisians as well, more difficult to tell. But the Franks themselves made extensive use of cavalry, not just against the people of Germany, what's now Germany, but also in against the Basques and down in Italy, and against the Muslims in the south of France. Remember, the south of France was occupied by Moors, by Muslim forces, until Charles Martel essentially forced them out. So much like in Spain, where the south of Spain was Muslim, the south of France was also Muslim. And you know, cavalry played a huge part in that. And Charlemagne's cavalry played many roles. They were often equipped with bows. Sometimes they were equipped with bows, lances, swords, as well as being armoured with shields. So they were multi-purpose, and they could dismount and fight as well. But they could travel around very quickly. And when you're talking about this period, when you're talking about the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, the ability to move an army across what's really quite a large area in that period relative to the population and everything else, with a cavalry force, is incredibly important. And when we look at things like the Song of Roland and things like this, it's characterised by this knightly idea of knights sort of riding, you know, long distances and then fighting a battle and then riding quickly somewhere else and fighting another battle. This is very much the birth of chivalry. Chivalry, of course, the word coming from cheval for horse. So that's where it all started, essentially. And we could say ultimately it started with the Roman Empire because, of course, the Romans made extensive use of armoured cavalry, which you could say was the birth of what we would now call knights. But in medieval Europe, really, you could say it was Charlemagne's empire that gave the birth of knights, and that kind of spread. And it spread to England via, and we're talking about England here, sorry for being Anglo-centric, but this is a question specifically about English armies. It spread to England via the Normans. So, how did we get from a position whereby you have Anglo-Saxon armies fighting entirely on foot, and then the Normans come in and introduce cavalry, but then somehow by the 100 Years' War, the English army is characterised yet again by fighting a lot on foot? Well, it's not a simple story. But I think what we have to say is there was a period in England where cavalry was dominant and was important. The time of William Marshall. I think if we look through the Norman period and we look through the 11th century, 12th century and into the 13th century, if we say into the first half of the 13th century, then cavalry was very much a dominant force. But a few things happened in the 13th century, towards the end of the 13th century and into the beginning of the 14th century, that really changed English military experience. Okay, so the Crusades are behind us now. The main Crusades, first three Crusades are behind us. And we're now into the late 13th century. The kings of England find themselves fighting with the Welsh, with the Irish and with the Scots. Obviously they're fighting with other people as well because everybody was fighting with everybody at this time in Europe. But in particular, what really dominated the English military experience of the late 13th and early 14th century was primarily the wars against the Welsh and then the wars against the Scottish. And in these wars, certain things were experienced. Firstly, in Wales, the Southern Welsh were very famous for using longbowmen. Okay, and now everybody realises that if you have a lot of arrows are quite a good antidote against horses. But there's something else that's also a good antidote against horses: pikes or long spears. Okay, and the Northern Welsh used long spears. Now, in the wars in Wales, essentially against the Llewellyns and the various other opponents that the kings of England were fighting against, generally speaking, the Southern Welsh were more allied with the English, generally speaking, after a certain date. And so the tradition of archery, which probably existed fairly strongly in England already, was reinvigorated by the fact that suddenly there were all these Southern Welsh archers as well to draw upon. And they went campaigning in Northern Wales. The Southern Wales, unlike in the modern mindset we think of England, Scotland and Wales in the mainland of the British Isles. But in fact, Wales wasn't one united kingdom really. It was a series of little kingdoms, incidentally in the same way as Scotland. So many Scottish patriots today who I talk to, and I am part Scottish, and as I mentioned previously, one of my ancestors actually fought for Robert the Bruce. So I don't feel I'm like completely typically English bias on this. But Scotland was a series of kingdoms. Wales was a series of kingdoms, let's say princedoms, and as England had been previously. Remember that England wasn't a unified country until quite late, well, very late in the Anglo-Saxon period. It consisted of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, various other bits. Okay, and Scotland and Wales were the same, and so the Southern Welsh had some degree of many of the Southern Welsh had some degree of animosity towards the Northern Welsh, and so the Southern Welsh fought alongside the English against the Northern Welsh. And the English found themselves fighting with an enlarged force of archers and fighting against people who did a lot of guerrilla tactics, and also used a lot of hit and run tactics. Incidentally, the English made extensive use of castles, which is why if you go to Northern Wales today, it's peppered with fantastic castles, some of the best castles you can find anywhere. And one of the reasons for that is essentially the conquest of Northern Wales. And the Northern Welsh, incidentally, were very good at attacking these castles as they were being built. But anyway, that's another story for another video. There we go. fundamentally, they found themselves fighting against forces, whether it be archers against southern Welsh or spear-armed northern Welsh, whereby their cavalry forces seem to have become less and less effective, because both of those things aren't very friendly to cavalry. Spears and bows, they're a good antidote to cavalry. And then of course there's the Scottish Wars against obviously William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and all of the others who decided to fight against the English rather than those Scots who fought on the side of the English, which, remember, as with the 100 Years' War, it wasn't simply England v Scotland. It's just the same with Culloden. You get Scots on both sides, okay? Just the same as you had Welsh on both sides in the Welsh Wars. And there were French on both sides in the 100 Years' War. And in the Scottish Wars, the Scots made extensive use, not of archers actually, but of Schiltrons. Now, Schiltrons are fantastic. They're essentially a pike block, okay? So don't think about necessarily sort of, 16, 20 foot long pikes, but probably you're talking about 12-foot long pikes, long spears essentially. And they made extensive use of mobile Schiltrons because, of course, this was an antidote to cavalry. So for hundreds of years, the English, the Anglo-Normans had used cavalry, and the Scots had developed their Schiltrons as an anti-cavalry arm. But thanks to the wars in Wales, the English now had an extensive drawing of archers. Now, archers are really good at cancelling out the advantages of a pike block, because you can have a pike block, they can stand there all day with their spears against the onrush of horses, but if they're getting peppered with arrows and they don't have heavy armour, then things aren't going to go too well for them. Now, in the Scottish Wars, things went back and forth. Obviously, the Wallace and Robert the Bruce won various, Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn and various other great victories for the Scots. But the English also won victories. But generally speaking, Schiltrons, the English learned the lesson from Schiltrons that essentially a pike block or an infantry force on foot with pole arms were incredibly resistant to, almost immune to cavalry. But they weren't immune to archers. But what did the English do? Well, the English, much like Charlemagne and much like the Roman Empire and much like the later British Empire, looked at something, saw that it was good and absorbed it. And so what the English war machine did by the beginning of the 100 Years' War is it brought in the lessons learned, particularly from the campaigns in Wales and Scotland, and they made almost no use of crossbows, whereas pretty much everyone else in Europe was using crossbows, which are fairly effective and fairly accurate, but a slow rate of fire. Obviously there's no fire involved, but let's call it rate of fire. And they brought in the philosophy of the Schiltron, or the mobile pike block essentially, and added to it archers, so that we see by the 100 Years' War this constant reference to the hearse arrangement, which we don't really know what that means, but we know enough from the descriptive accounts that the English were making use essentially of an infantry formation where you intermingled or interlocked somehow a force of archers with a force of essentially spearmen. Archers, spearmen, archers, spearmen. And not only that, but remember, of course, that unlike the Scots who were fighting a war of independence against the English, the English had greater access to armour. So a lot of the infantry with spears, and to a degree the archers as well, in the English force fighting in the 100 Years' War, had better equipment, so they were slightly more invulnerable to, or slightly better protected against anything coming their way, like crossbow bolts or whatever. So, by and large, it seems that through these wars, primarily against the Welsh and Scots, but there were probably other external influences as well, the English found that their best way of fighting was on foot. But there's one other thing I want to mention, and that is that within the greater context of this, if we think back to that Battle of Hastings Bayeux Tapestry image, within the grander scheme of things, in the medieval period, the English, and in fact no British people, you could include the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish in this as well, were never ever really good with cavalry. They were never rated as a cavalry force. Everyone knew that the best cavalry was to be found in France or Spain or Italy, sometimes in parts of Germany, or indeed, you know, if we're looking at the Mongols or Eastern Europe, the Slavic peoples. The English, the Scandinavians and the Northern Germans and the Dutch in this period were never rated as good with cavalry. Maybe they didn't have access to such good horses, maybe they just didn't have the particular cultural infrastructure or basis for it. But fundamentally there seems to have been something within the psyche of the northern peoples, the Scandinavian, British and Northern Germanic peoples, that preferred fighting on foot. And this in the 100 Years' War, predominantly, not entirely, predominantly, and the Wars of the Roses to a large extent, is what the English did. The English fought on foot using essentially Schiltron philosophy, pike blocks, and archers with their very high rate of fire. And just to finish off, as I mentioned a second ago, this is, don't think that the English didn't use cavalry. There was a period in the Anglo-Norman period where the cavalry were essentially Norman when they did make use of cavalry, but they were Normans really. And there was a period, you know, during the 100 Years' War, there were occasions when the English did use cavalry to pursue a fleeing enemy, to scout, to reconnoitre, this kind of thing. But by and large, they were never great cavalry users. And to some extent, you could even say this goes all the way up to the Napoleonic period, where many European powers were quite rude about English cavalry and said that they weren't very well trained and didn't ride very well and things like this. So there we go. I hope that covers the question. It's a fairly long answer, but I've tried to keep it as brief as I possibly could to represent my view. And again, if you feel like I've missed anything out, feel free to comment underneath. My view of why the English used these particular tactics in the 100 Years' War. Cheers for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.